Well, welcome to James chapter 2. Last week we talked about James chapter 1. We talked about trials and temptations. We talked about praying for wisdom and not doubting. We talked about the rich and the poor, and what it means to have possessions, that living in light of the temptations that brings to us. We talked about living the good life. We do not live a life of the moral filth that is prevalent in the world, but we live in tune with the Word of God and to really listen to the Word, to do the Word. And then James ends chapter 1 talking about widows and orphans and how serving them is pure religion. And that brings us into chapter 2. These same kind of themes just tie their way right through into chapter 2. Just like he talked about the brother in humble circumstances in 1:9 and the rich brother in 1:10, he says in chapter 2, verse 1, "My brothers, as believers in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ, don't show favoritism. Suppose a man comes into your meeting wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in shabby clothes also comes in. If you show special attention to the man wearing fine clothes and say, 'Here's a good seat for you,' but say to the poor man, 'You stand there or sit here on the floor by my feet,' have you not discriminated amongst yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts?" Literally, he says, a gold-fingered man. You think about someone with so many rings on their fingers. It just looks like their fingers are made out of gold. And when he talks about their meetings, that's actually the word synagogue. And it may be that at this point in time, so early in the development of the Christianity and the Christian faith, that Jews and Gentiles maybe are still assembling in a synagogue setting together. It's hard to know because that word can also just mean an assembly or a gathering. But James's teaching is very clear that we are not to be people who are judging other people, judging by appearances, judging about wealth. If someone pulls into the church parking lot in a brand new BMW or Mercedes or something like that, something that looks very expensive, that we're not to give that person special treatment. We're not supposed to give them a special seat. We're not supposed to treat them with special honor to the neglect of other people, especially to make those kind of distinctions are worldly distinctions, and they're actually out of line with what James wrote in James chapter 1, verse 9, that the one who is lowly in the world is actually the brother who's in high position, and the one who is rich is actually the one who may be in some spiritual jeopardy or danger. We need to be people who do not make those kind of discriminations or distinctions, because then he says we become judges who have evil thoughts. These discriminatory, socioeconomic discriminatory thoughts are evil thoughts, and they have no place in the family of God amongst the people of God. And then he elaborates. James says, "Listen, my dear brothers," verse 5, "has not God chosen those who are poor in the eyes of the world to be rich in faith?" He's getting onto a new theme here. Faith is really what matters, and it's often the poor who depend most upon God. "Did not God choose those who are poor in the eyes of the world to be rich in faith and to inherit the kingdom he promised those who love him?" You hear the echoes of the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," etc., etc. It sounds very much like that. He says in verse 6, "But you have insulted the poor." So in other words, there's something going on in this group he's writing to that he's addressing particular situations. These are not just generic teachings of wisdom. He says, this is something you have done. You have mistreated the poor. You've insulted the poor. And then he talks about, why do you do these kinds of things? It doesn't even make sense from a worldly perspective. He says, is it not the rich who are exploiting you? Are they not the ones who are dragging you into court? Are they not the ones who are slandering the noble name of him to whom you belong? He's saying, why on earth would you discriminate against the poor and the needy and elevate the rich when it's the rich who are giving you the most problems, when it's the rich who are dragging you into court, when it's the rich who are taking advantage of you? And maybe that's why James said in James chapter 1 that it's really difficult for the rich in the kingdom, because these are the kind of things that he's observing that are happening among the rich toward the poor. And then he points us again to something that Jesus talked about, and it's not just Jesus, but also going back into Leviticus about this royal law. He says in verse 8, chapter 2, if you really keep the royal law found in Scripture, the graphe, the writings, what are the writings? Really the Old Testament would be his writings at this point in time. He says, this is from Leviticus 19:18, and also Jesus quoted in Matthew 22:39, love your neighbor as yourself. He says, if you keep that royal law, you are doing right. But if you show favoritism, you sin and are convicted by the law as lawbreakers. For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it. For the one who said, do not commit adultery, also said, do not murder. If you do not commit adultery, but you commit murder, you have still become a lawbreaker. So if your goal is not to be a lawbreaker, then you need to really make sure that you follow the whole law. Speak and act as those who are going to be judged by the law that gives freedom, because judgment without mercy will be shown to anyone who has not been merciful, because mercy triumphs over judgment. Wow. If there was ever a verse that we needed, it's that verse. It's 2:13. It's 2:12 and 13. Speak and act as those who are going to be judged by the law that gives freedom. In other words, we need to live in such a way that we understand that the law that we are living under is actually a law that comes about to bring us freedom, not oppression. And then he says it's that judgment without mercy will be shown to anyone who has not been merciful. Wow, what motivation to be merciful. And then he gives this last line that just is something we so need to hear, that mercy triumphs over judgment. In so many Christian circles, you would think it was exactly the opposite. You would think that judgment triumphs over mercy, that we are just teetotalers to the law and to the rules and pharisaical about things, so much so that we're just so, we can be, and hear me clearly, can be so judgmental. But mercy triumphs over judgment. You think about what's the point of all these things. The point is to bring someone closer to Jesus. What's going to get them closer to Jesus? Judgment or mercy? Mercy, I think, presupposes that this person knows they've done wrong. Why else would it be mercy if no one understands they've done wrong? We're showing mercy to someone even though they've done wrong, and in receiving that mercy, they're going to come closer to Christ. But if all we do is harsh, bitter judgment and just bring it down on people all the time, then they're not going to mature, they're not going to grow, they're not going to connect with Jesus. Now, James chapter 2, 14 and following is one of the most pivotal sections in the entire book of James. It gave James this reputation hundreds of years ago about not being a very good book of the Bible. Martin Luther, early on in his life, called it a strawy epistle made of straw, a letter made of straw. It just didn't hold up very well. Later on, if my memory is right, Martin Luther kind of recanted of that statement, maybe changed his mind, or at least said more positive things about the book of James. And people have had a hard time reconciling James and Paul. And I'm not going to claim to do a perfect job of that, but we're going to take a stab at understanding how these things work together, comparing James chapter 2 with Ephesians chapter 2. In Ephesians chapter 2, Paul says we're not saved by works, we're saved by grace, so that no man may boast. And now James, and I think if we listen to this, we have to understand he's writing to particular people in a particular circumstance. These are not just random truths that he's just giving to us here. He's writing to people who are going through specific issues. So he says, what good is it, my brothers, if a man claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save him? Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to him, go, I wish you well, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about his physical needs, what good is it? You can imagine James probably knows exactly who he's writing to, and he knows exact circumstances or situations that they're engaged in. So he says, just like if you know someone's naked, you don't clothe them, or if you know someone's hungry and you don't feed them, faith without works is useless. Faith without works is dead, he says. What good is it? He says, in the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. But someone will say, you have faith and I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by what I do. You believe that there is one God? Good. Even the demons believe that and shudder. So he says, you foolish man, do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Was not our ancestor Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did, okay? So here's the thing. We're saved by grace, we're saved by because of our faith through grace, not by works, so that no one can boast, from Ephesians 2, 8, and 9. But now James is telling us that our works, our deeds still matter. He is not saying that you can do enough to get to heaven. He is saying that your faith is legitimized, evidenced, by the way you live your life. Imagine you profess Jesus, but you go and live for Satan. What does it matter that you say these things? You say you believe these things, but you live a completely different way. What he's saying is, he's saying that the way we live our lives, the actions that we execute on a regular basis, are evidence of the kind of faith that we have, because everyone in this world operates on faith, not just Christians. Atheists operate on faith, just faith in the wrong thing, the wrong person, in themselves, or in the universe, or something like that. We all operate on some level of faith, and our deeds, our actions, demonstrate where our allegiance actually lies. And again, the word faith can be translated allegiance, in that we give our loyalty, we give our fidelity, our allegiance to someone who is more sovereign than ourselves. So how do you show that you truly have faith? It's by the way you live. Are you acting as if it's true? I say, well, I believe in God. Do you trust God? How do you know you trust God? It's by the way you live. Are you living in such a way, acting in such a way that you really can demonstrate that your faith is real, that you truly do love God and trust God. Think about Abraham. He could say all day, well, I love God, I trust God, I have faith in God. And he goes, go and offer Isaac, your only son, up there on Mount Moriah. And he says, well, not that much. I don't trust you that much. No, instead, in Hebrews 11, it says, Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. He was going to kill Isaac. Abraham was going to kill him. He had no Bible in his hand. He had no story of resurrection up to that point in Genesis. He had to reason that I trust God so thoroughly that I must do what he says, which is kill my son, the one of the promise, and that God will still make good on that very same promise that has to come through this boy. So what's the path of faith that connects those dots? It's resurrection. And Abraham came up with that completely on his own. And it demonstrated that his faith was legitimate, that his faith was real. And then he says in verse 25, in the same way was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them out in a different direction. As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. So Rahab herself demonstrates, think about the Rahab story. When the spies come in, she says she knows about this God. She believes in this God. She's terrified of this God. She has faith in Yahweh. But it's not until she acts on that faith, by hiding the spies, which could cost her her life, but instead she must reason that by hiding the people of God, that the God of these people of God will take care of her. That's faith. That's faith that's lived out. And in church, it's important for us to understand and realize if we're going to be people of faith, we have to live these things out. This goes back to the widows and orphans at the end of chapter 1. That's what pure religion is not just to say widows and orphans are great. It's to love them. It's to serve them. It's to provide for them. It's to do things for them. Because faith without works is ultimately dead. Real faith is living faith. Real faith is active faith. Trusting faith. Faith is trust. And trust requires actions. When our boys are little and they're first learning to swim and you can stand there in the pool, chest deep in pool with your arms up saying, jump to me. And it depends, how scared are they really? And when they're really little, there's more fear than there is faith, more fear than there is trust. But eventually they learn to jump to you, that you will indeed catch them. And if you really better make sure you catch them that first time or two, because if you don't, you've just whittled away on their faith. But I'm going to tell you, God's going to catch you every time. And this builds our faith. Think about this. Of all the things that God has done for you, of all the blessings that God has given to you, does that not build your faith that when you end up in extenuating circumstances, challenging situations, that you think back on God's faithfulness, and that builds within us our own faith? Let me ask you this. What is God's faithfulness? Is it not when we see God acting? Do we say God's faithful that he said he loves us? Or do we say he's faithful when he acts and he does things on our behalf? Which is it? Well, I'd say in a sense it's both. But we know it and experience it when God works. The same is true of our faith. In our faithfulness, we can say it's true when it works. When we put it into action, when we live as if these things are true. One of the illustrations that often comes to mind for me is like a grandfather sitting in the living room and the blinds are pulled down and it's in the afternoon and he says, hey, there's a dinosaur in the backyard, right? And if the grandkids are really young, they may say, no way, really? Are you serious? There's a dinosaur in the backyard? Really? As they get a little bit older, they go, oh, Grandpa, you're just kidding, right? And they may still go peek out those shades. And they finally get to a certain age where they've heard that enough to go, okay, we know that's got to be a joke, right? But there's that in-between stage when you really, as a kid, you really believe anything he says because Grandpa's trustworthy. You believe him. You have faith in him, right? So let's be people of faith. Let's be people of mercy because mercy triumphs over judgment. And to be a person of faith is to be a person of mercy. Doesn't mean there's never any room for any kind of judgment in the world ever. It just means that we need to lean more heavily into mercy and grace than we do judgment. And you allow God to be the judge. It's not our position to make all the judgments in the world. So I appreciate you hanging in there and watching these videos on the book of James. I'm looking forward to visiting in James chapter 3 with you next week. Invite a friend, tell someone about it, somebody, and let them know it's here because this is an important study and we want people to come to faith in Jesus if they don't already trust him, to learn to trust him, to learn to follow him, to learn to love him.